The fog hung heavy over London's East End, curling around the crooked chimneys and narrow streets like a restless ghost. The year was 1885, and the Old Nichol Street slum, often whispered about in fearful tones, was alive with the low murmur of survival. Here, life was harsh, unrelenting, and cruelly unfair, and the people who called this place home were hardened in ways the comfortable city dwellers of Westminster could scarcely imagine. But tonight, as the gas lamps flickered and the air grew thick with the stench of refuse and coal smoke, something stirred that would reveal the grim reality of one of Victorian London's most brutal slums. Nichol Street wasn't just dirty. It was a place where despair clung to the walls and seeped into the very stones beneath your feet. The narrow alleys were choked with garbage, overflowing privies, and the occasional puddle of water that carried the city's diseases like silent assassins. Children ran barefoot, their small bodies skittish and wary of grown men who might not have a kind word to spare. Women balanced baskets of coal and bread, trading scraps for pennies, while men hunched over in the shadows, nursing wounds, some from work, others from fights fought in desperation rather than malice. Life here was a constant struggle, and yet it had its rhythm, its own dark poetry. Among the residents of Old Nichol Street, certain figures stood out, not because they were powerful or rich, but because their stories carried the weight of the slum itself. There was Mrs. Henshaw, a widow who had lost 3 children to disease, but still ran a tiny corner shop selling tea and sugar at inflated prices, barely eking out enough to survive. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and she had a way of knowing when trouble was coming before it arrived. Then there was Tommy Two Fingers Mallory, a boy who had spent more nights in the police lockup than his own bed, navigating a life where survival often meant stealing or fighting. And, of course, the shadowy presence of Mr. Silas Crane, a man whose origins were unknown, but whose influence over the street's more desperate residents was undeniable. His name whispered in corners, and his watchful gaze was feared even by grown men. The night carried a weight of anticipation. Something in the air told the people of Nichol Street that the ordinary cruelty of life here might be on the brink of something far worse. Perhaps it was the sudden quiet that had fallen, broken only by the occasional cough or the clatter of a wagon on cobblestones. Or perhaps it was the arrival of new faces, strangers who moved with purpose, eyes darting, carrying with them an energy that the residents instinctively understood was not good news. Filthy Old Nichol Street had always been a place of extremes. On one end, families crammed into single rooms with little more than blankets and hoped to keep them warm. On the other, illegal gambling dens, unlicensed pubs, and small-time crime rings operated openly, sometimes even with a crooked wink from the local authorities. Disease and filth were constant companions. Cholera had swept through the neighborhood only a few years prior, claiming dozens of lives in a single month. Tuberculosis lingered quietly, stealing strength and life from those too weak to fight it. And yet, the street never stopped breathing, never stopped its relentless dance of survival, cruelty, and resilience. This story isn't just about the filth and disease. It's about people, ordinary and extraordinary, who inhabited a place that time seems to have forgotten. It's about the mothers who sang lullabies over cracked wooden floors, trying to soothe hungry children. It's about the boys who ran errands and stole when they had no other choice. It's about the old men who told stories of London before the industrial smoke had turned the sky gray. And it's about the unseen forces, the poverty, the corruption, and sometimes even the cruelty of fate that shaped every decision, every breath, every glance exchanged on these narrow streets. Walking through Nichol Street, a visitor from a wealthier part of London might have been struck by a sense of chaos. But for those who lived there, it was survival, orderly in its own way. Doors were barred at night with whatever could be found. Planks, nails, sometimes just a chair wedged across the threshold. Families huddled together to avoid the cold, while rats scavenged openly, bold enough to challenge the humans for scraps of food. And above all of it, the gas lamps, flickering against the heavy fog, cast long shadows that seemed to move and breathe, as if the street itself were alive and watching. The history of Old Nichol Street is intertwined with the rise of industrial London. Factories belched smoke that darkened the skies, while wages remained painfully low. Men worked long hours in hazardous conditions. Women labored in sweatshops, and children, some barely 10 years old, were forced into employment just to keep the family afloat. Crime was an almost inevitable response to hunger, and the authorities often looked the other way unless a scandal reached the press. Even then, the consequences were fleeting, replaced by a new wave of misfortune that washed over the street like an unending tide. It is said that if you listened closely on certain nights, you could hear the whispers of the past carried by the wind through the alleys. Stories of pickpockets and petty thieves, of families torn apart by disease, of strangers who came and vanished without a trace. Some say that the Old Nichol Street slum held secrets that no historian could fully uncover. Secrets of desperate men and women, of alliances formed in shadow, and of crimes that were never solved. And tonight, as the mist thickened and the gas lamps flickered, it felt as though those secrets were on the verge of revealing themselves. Among the dimly lit tenements, a young girl named Eliza huddled close to her younger brother, whispering stories to keep the darkness at bay. Her parents had disappeared months ago, victims of the slum's harsh reality, leaving her and her brother to fend for themselves. Eliza was clever, observant, and determined, traits that had kept her alive this long, but she could sense that something was changing. The street itself seemed to grow restless, as if anticipating an event that would alter the delicate balance of survival. And then there were the newcomers, men in heavy coats, faces hidden beneath hats pulled low, walking with a purpose that suggested they were not ordinary visitors. The children noticed them first, their games pausing as eyes tracked these strangers moving silently through the mist. Rumors began to spread, as whispers always do in Nichol Street, about business, debts, and danger. The adults exchanged wary glances. Something about this night felt different, heavier, more ominous. The sense of foreboding clung to the alleyways, wrapping the residents in an invisible tension that even the bravest could not ignore. Old Nichol Street had survived cholera, fires, and crime waves, but survival did not mean safety. Life here was fragile, and the residents knew it. Each decision carried weight. Each choice could mean life or death. And tonight, the air itself seemed to hold a warning. That even in a place as brutal and unforgiving as this, change was coming. One that would test the very limits of human endurance, cunning, and courage. The story of Victorian London's Old Nichol Street is not merely a tale of dirt and disease. It is a window into the lives of those who struggled, suffered, and sometimes thrived in the shadows of a city whose grandeur often ignored them. It is a story of survival, of cunning, of hope flickering in the darkest corners, and of the relentless grip of poverty that shaped every human interaction. And as we step into the twisting, filthy alleys of this notorious slum, we are about to uncover tales that are shocking, heartbreaking, and yet strangely human. Stories that force us to confront the reality of life in a world where the line between survival and surrender is thinner than the fog that blankets the streets. But as the gas lamps flickered and the fog thickened, a chilling sense of anticipation settled over Old Nichol Street. Something was coming, something that would test the resilience of its residents in ways they could never have imagined. And in that moment, as shadows lengthened and the night grew colder, the stage was set for a story that would reveal the true horror and humanity of one of Victorian London's most brutal slums. The first hints of dawn struggled to push through the dense fog, casting a pale, ghostly light over the cobblestones. The street seemed quieter now, but that quiet was deceptive. It was a silence that carried the weight of expectation, the kind of silence that preceded events impossible to ignore. In Old Nichol Street, silence was rarely innocent. It was often the precursor to mischief, misfortune, or confrontation. Windows rattled in their frames as the wind sifted through broken shutters, and the smell of coal and refuse lingered even stronger in the cold morning air. Eliza clutched her brother closer as she peeked through a crack in the wooden shutter. She could just make out the shapes of people moving in the mist, their steps cautious and calculated. These were not the usual residents, not the familiar faces of neighbors or petty thieves. No, these were outsiders, their presence disturbing the fragile rhythm of the street. The children's whispers carried from one alley to another, spreading a subtle unease, until even the adults took notice. Life in Old Nichol Street had always demanded vigilance. You never knew which neighbor might turn on you, which stranger might befriend you with hidden motives, or which alley might hide dangers unseen. Pickpockets thrived not just because of poverty, but because the city's structures left gaps where desperation and opportunity met. Fires, disease, and crime were routine hazards, but tonight there was something different, a sense of imminent upheaval that no one could put into words. Mrs. Henshaw emerged from her small shop, wiping her hands on a rag, eyes scanning the street with her usual scrutiny. Her presence, though small, carried authority. She knew every face, every habit, every lie whispered along these alleys. When she noticed the newcomers, her brow furrowed. Something about the way they moved, the way they didn't acknowledge the regular flow of the street, set her nerves on edge. She had seen too many young men and women vanish in the shadows of the city, only for whispers to return of desperate deals, violence, or worse. Meanwhile, Tommy Two Fingers Mallory darted across the street, slipping between barrels and broken crates with the kind of skill that had saved him more than once. His fingers itched with the thrill of survival, yet there was an unfamiliar tension in the air that made him pause. The usual games of stealth and theft suddenly felt riskier. Even the rats seemed to sense a change, skittering into the shadows more quickly than usual, leaving behind scraps that no child dared to touch. The newcomers, 3 men, tall and imposing, their faces shadowed beneath heavy hats, stopped near a street corner. They spoke in hushed tones, glancing around with the careful attention of those accustomed to danger. The residents noticed their subtle gestures, the way they scanned doorways and windows. Some nodded quietly to each other, while others simply stepped back into their homes, peering from behind curtains. Everyone understood, without needing to speak, that these men carried intent. As the morning fog began to thin, the harsh reality of Old Nichol Street emerged once more. Laundry hung limply between buildings, tattered and patched, fluttering faintly in the weak breeze. Children ran barefoot through puddles, chasing rats or each other, oblivious to the dangers around them. The narrow streets were slick with mud, soot, and refuse, yet life pressed forward. Mothers called out to keep children from straying too close to open sewers. Men argued over debts, wages, or stolen goods, voices raised but often half-hearted, words flung in desperation more than anger. In one corner, a small gathering formed around a street vendor, a man selling bread that was stale but still edible. His customers, faces lined with exhaustion and worry, handed over coins with trembling hands. Every transaction was measured, calculated. Every penny mattered in a place where poverty was the law of the land. Eliza's eyes followed him as she considered her own small collection of coins, gathered from odd jobs and favors. The future of her day, like so many before, would depend on luck, timing, and the sharpness of her mind. Across the street, Mr. Silas Crane watched quietly, leaning against a brick wall. Unlike the children, the street vendors, or even Mrs. Henshaw, he did not move hurriedly with life's demands. Instead, he observed, calculating, waiting. His presence was both unnerving and commanding. Crane seemed to know more about the street than anyone, yet no one knew his story. Whispers suggested he had arrived years ago, emerging from the shadows of London itself. Some claimed he had ties to the police, others whispered of criminals who feared him even more than the law. But no one could be certain. And tonight, his interest in the newcomers hinted at a deeper tension that promised to unravel in ways the street had never experienced. As the morning dragged on, news of a new danger began to circulate. Some said it was an illness, carried from another part of London. Others spoke of a theft that had gone horribly wrong, leaving one man dead in a dark alley. Even children repeated the rumors, their small voices echoing between the narrow streets, lending urgency to the tension. Yet no one could verify the truth, and in Old Nichol Street, unverified stories often became reality. Fear, after all, was as contagious as any disease that lingered in the filth. Eliza, undeterred but wary, decided to explore the street herself. She needed to understand the whispers, to see what the adults might not dare to confront. Her brother, clutching a threadbare blanket, followed silently, trusting her instincts though he did not fully comprehend the danger. Together, they slipped past the vendor, past the men arguing over wages, and toward the shadows where the newcomers had paused. Each step was careful, measured, as though the street itself could punish a misstep. Meanwhile, tensions among the adults began to rise. Mrs. Henshaw conferred quietly with neighbors, eyes darting to every movement in the alleys. The men in the shadows had drawn attention, and with it, suspicion, fear, and unease. Arguments flared over interpretation of the newcomer's intent. Some suggested calling the authorities, though many knew better than to trust them in matters concerning Old Nichol Street. Others debated whether the strangers were simply businessmen or troublemakers seeking to exploit the slum's vulnerabilities. The fog lifted slightly, revealing the street in stark detail. Crumbling brick walls, broken windows patched with rags or newspapers, piles of refuse that could not be removed fast enough, and the ever-present scurrying of rats and vermin. In the midst of it, the residents went about their business, yet the unease was palpable. Something was changing, and though no one could articulate exactly what, instinct warned them that life, as they knew it, would not remain the same. And then, the unexpected happened. A sharp cry echoed from a side alley, piercing the usual murmurs of the street. It was brief, but unmistakable, a sound of distress, sudden and human. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, and the newcomers froze in their tracks. Mrs. Henshaw's hand went to her mouth, silently urging those around her to stay calm. Tommy crouched low behind a barrel, eyes wide, trying to see what had caused the scream. Eliza gripped her brother's arm tightly, heart pounding in rhythm with the sudden tension that gripped the street. For a moment, the entire slum seemed suspended, caught in a pause between the ordinary cruelty of daily life and the unknown threat that had just arrived. Every resident, young and old, sensed it. Something had broken the routine. Something was coming. And as the fog continued to curl through the alleys, thickening once more, the residents of Old Nichol Street could only wait, breath held, for the next chapter to unfold, uncertain if they would survive it or be swept away by forces beyond their understanding. The cry had barely faded when the street returned to its uneasy rhythm, but the tension lingered like smoke that refuses to disperse. Conversations halted midward, and even the rats seemed to hesitate in their scavenging. Eliza and her brother huddled closer to the wall, trying to peer into the alley where the sound had come from. A single lantern flickered dimly at the far end, its glow revealing the outline of a figure slumped against the bricks. It was impossible to tell whether the person was hurt, exhausted, or worse, but the sight sent a ripple of dread through the children. Old Nichol Street was not unfamiliar with danger, but this was different. There was no argument, no squabble over stolen goods. This was raw, human vulnerability exposed for all to see. The residents had learned to harden themselves against such moments, to step over the broken and the weak without pity if survival demanded it. But now, even the toughest faces in the street paused, instinctively sensing that whatever had occurred in that shadowed alley was a warning, something that could not be ignored. Mrs. Henshaw emerged cautiously from her doorway, the morning light catching the lines etched deep into her face. She moved toward the alley, each step careful and deliberate, her eyes scanning for signs of danger. Her reputation as a woman who could read the street preceded her. People trusted her judgment, not because she had authority from the law, but because she understood the unspoken rules that governed life here. She reached the alley and froze, just short of the figure on the ground. It was a young man, no older than Tommy, though he had clearly endured more than most men twice his age. His clothes were torn and filthy, his hands bruised, and a dark stain spread across his shirt. He was breathing, but shallowly, and the faint rise and fall of his chest suggested a struggle that had left him nearly broken. Mrs. Henshaw knelt beside him, speaking softly, her voice careful not to startle him further. As she examined the figure, her eyes narrowed. This was no ordinary victim of the slum's cruelty or chance. It was a message, a deliberate act designed to send fear rippling through the street. Word of the incident spread quickly. By mid-morning, clusters of residents had gathered, whispering among themselves, sharing fragmented observations and wild theories. Some suggested the young man had been caught stealing from one of the newcomers. Others believed he had stumbled upon something he should never have seen, something that had drawn the attention of people far more dangerous than the usual street criminals. Rumors, as always, grew in the telling. By the time the newcomers had moved on, speculation had already built a web of tension around their presence, connecting them to the injured youth and to events that had not yet unfolded. Eliza's curiosity outweighed her fear. She crept closer to the crowd, keeping low and careful, eyes wide as she tried to absorb everything around her. She noticed Mr. Silas Crane standing a short distance away, arms folded, observing silently. His gaze was sharp, calculating, the kind of watchful presence that could unsettle even the bravest adult. Unlike the rest of the crowd, Crane did not approach the young man. He did not whisper theories or gossip. He simply observed, taking in details that no one else seemed to notice. The angle of the young man's injuries, the direction the strangers had fled, even the discarded scraps and footprints along the alley. Children scuttled along the edges of the crowd, mimicking the adults but unable to hide their fascination. Tommy lingered nearby, fists clenching and unclenching as he fought the urge to intervene, knowing that curiosity in Old Nichol Street often had consequences far beyond one's imagination. Eliza tugged at his sleeve, urging caution, but inside she felt the same restless drive to uncover the truth. Even now, as she clutched her brother and tried to steady her racing heart, she sensed that the morning had shifted. The street she thought she knew, with all its predictable hardships and daily struggles, had transformed into something uncertain, shadowed by danger and secrets that demanded attention. For the adults, the injury was not merely an isolated event. It was a sign, a disturbance in the fragile balance that allowed life in the slum to continue. Crime, poverty, and disease were constants, but they had limits, boundaries that the residents understood intuitively. When someone violated those boundaries, when something unexpected and violent occurred, the social order, such as it was, shook. A single act of violence, even toward a stranger, could ripple outward, touching every resident, every street corner, every narrow alleyway. The question on everyone's mind was simple. Who was responsible and why? By late morning, the newcomers had vanished, leaving behind only footprints in the mud and a lingering sense of unease. Their presence, brief as it had been, had altered the atmosphere of the street. Children whispered about men with dark hats. Adults speculated on threats beyond their control, and the young man in the alley remained a symbol of what might come. Mrs. Henshaw had arranged for him to be taken to a safer location, relying on neighbors she trusted implicitly. Yet even in the act of care, there was tension, the awareness that helping him could draw attention from the wrong people. And in Old Nichol Street, attention often had a steep price. The day dragged on slowly, each hour marked by small struggles for survival. Laundry was hung, coal delivered, food sold and rationed, and the usual disputes over money, property, and territory continued. Yet beneath it all, a quiet fear persisted. Even the air seemed heavier, as though the fog that had lingered overnight had not fully lifted, leaving behind a residue of unease that clung to skin and clothes alike. Residents glanced over shoulders, children hesitated at street corners, and the whispers of the young man's attack circulated like an invisible current. Eliza and her brother returned to the narrow room they shared, a space too small to feel secure, yet familiar enough to provide some semblance of safety. She recounted what she had seen and heard, carefully omitting details that might alarm her brother too much, though her own fear was impossible to hide. He listened, wide-eyed, absorbing the tension that had infiltrated even the smallest parts of their daily life. Outside, the slum moved on as best it could, but the incident in the alley had left its mark, a quiet scar that would shape the events to come. By evening, the street had grown dark again, the gas lamps flickering as though tired of their duty. The sounds of labor and commerce faded, replaced by distant arguments, the occasional cry of a child, and the restless shuffle of rats through debris. In every shadow, the residents felt the memory of the day's disturbances. No one knew exactly what would happen next, but instinct told them that the equilibrium had been broken. Old Nichol Street, brutal and unyielding as it was, had been challenged, and the consequences were not yet fully visible. As night settled, the air thickened with anticipation. Even the newcomers seemed to have left traces beyond the injured youth. The whisper of rumors, the tension of mystery, the subtle rearrangement of fear and power. Tommy and Eliza lay awake in their small room, listening to the street outside. The cries of the day, the shuffle of boots, the low murmur of conversations, all carried a hidden message, one they could not yet decipher. And in the stillness between sounds, they imagined what might come, each shadow threatening new challenges and revelations. The story of Old Nichol Street was far from over. It was a living, breathing entity, shaped by the people who lived there and the events that constantly tested them. And now, with the morning's violence and the strange visitors, the stage was set for a series of events that would push the slum to its limits. Crime, poverty, fear, and survival were constants, but the unknown, the forces that lurked just beyond the familiar streets, would soon demand more than courage. It would demand cunning, resourcefulness, and perhaps even a reckoning that no one could anticipate. And so, as the fog settled once more and the gas lamps cast their trembling light across the streets, the residents of Old Nichol Street waited. They did not know what was coming. They only knew that the delicate balance of their brutal, filthy, and unrelenting world had shifted, and that the story of the East End slum, with all its darkness and humanity, was only beginning to unfold. The following morning, Old Nichol Street seemed almost unchanged on the surface, yet the undercurrent of unease remained. Sunlight struggled to break through the lingering fog, painting the narrow alleys with a weak, gray light. The smell of coal, sewage, and damp bricks still clung to every corner, and the residents moved with the same routine as always, hustling to earn a few coins, scolding children, or squabbling over debts. But behind a familiar rhythm, tension hummed like an invisible thread ready to snap. Eliza, though still small, had begun to understand the subtle codes of the street. She knew which windows to avoid, which neighbors could be trusted for information, and which streets offered the safest shortcuts. Her brother followed her carefully, imitating her caution, but never fully grasping why it mattered. Together, they navigated the alleys, listening to whispers, watching shadows, and trying to make sense of the morning's events. Every stranger who passed was noted, every gesture remembered. In Old Nichol Street, memory was survival. Forgetting was dangerous. Mrs. Henshaw, for her part, had spent the morning organizing the young man who had been found in the alley. She patched his wounds as best she could with limited supplies and gave him a place to rest, but her eyes never stopped scanning the street. She had lived long enough to know that no act of kindness went unnoticed in this neighborhood, and sometimes what seemed generous could invite danger. She understood, more than most, that the Old Nichol Street slum was a place where decisions carried consequences far beyond their intention. The young man himself was quiet, barely speaking, though his eyes told stories of hardship, fear, and resilience. Eliza had watched him from a corner of the room, noting the way he flinched at sudden movements, the tension in his hands, and the subtle way he listened to the sounds outside. She did not yet know who he was or why he had ended up in the alley, but she sensed that his presence was not coincidental. Some instincts she had learned were too strong to ignore. Meanwhile, the newcomers had left a mark on the street that no one could ignore. Rumors of their identities swirled. Businessmen, thugs from other parts of London, men sent by someone with a hidden agenda. The truth was impossible to determine, and in a neighborhood where suspicion was a constant companion, uncertainty bred both fear and curiosity. Residents speculated quietly, each theory building upon the last, until it seemed as though the street itself had become a web of intrigue, every corner holding potential secrets. Life, of course, continued despite the unease. Children ran through puddles and mud, scavenging scraps or playing games that often ended in bruises. Vendors hawked stale bread and coal, exchanging goods for coins that carried the weight of a week's labor. Men argued over debts, wages, and territory, while women whispered about illness, theft, or unseen threats. But beneath it all, the memory of the young man in the alley lingered, a reminder that danger could arrive without warning and alter life in an instant. The history of Old Nichol Street added layers to the fear and fascination. The East End had always been a place of extremes, home to both desperate poverty and fleeting opportunity. Factories and warehouses lined the outskirts, filling the air with smoke and the sound of machines. Many of the residents had worked in these buildings at some point, earning wages that barely covered rent and bread. Others had arrived as refugees from even harsher conditions elsewhere, hoping for a chance to survive. Over time, the neighborhood had developed its own rhythms, traditions, and unwritten rules that outsiders rarely understood and often broke to their peril. Mr. Silas Crane, observing from his shadowed corner, seemed to embody the history of the street itself. He moved through the alleys with ease, slipping past children and adults alike, unseen yet always watching. His knowledge of the street's routines, dangers, and hidden corners made him a figure of quiet authority. People speculated endlessly about his past, weaving stories that ranged from him being a former policeman to a man connected to secret societies in London. The truth, as always, was likely far stranger than any of the rumors. And Crane's calm attention to the newcomers suggested that whatever was happening in Old Nichol Street, it mattered to him more than it did to anyone else. By mid-morning, the injured young man had begun to regain some strength, but his presence continued to ripple tension through the neighborhood. He remained quiet, and when asked about what had happened, he offered only vague gestures, shaking his head as if to suggest that some truths were better left unspoken. Mrs. Henshaw, patient and knowing, did not press him. She understood the value of silence in a place like this. Sometimes, keeping quiet was the difference between life and death. Eliza spent much of the day observing the street, learning more about the lives around her. She noticed the patterns in the alleyways, the way children avoided certain corners, the subtle signs that indicated who could be trusted and who should be avoided. She watched as men traded information through subtle glances and gestures, as women shared gossip that carried hidden warnings, and as the newcomers' presence continued to influence even those who had not seen them directly. It was a complex dance, a delicate balance that only those who lived within the filth and danger of the street could understand. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the alleys, a sense of anticipation returned. It was not the kind of anticipation that brought excitement or joy. It was a quiet, pressing awareness that the street was alive in ways beyond what could be seen or touched. The events of the morning, the cry in the alley, the newcomer's brief presence, the injured young man, had shifted the neighborhood's balance. People felt it in their bones, a subtle vibration of tension that threaded through conversations, movements, and even the air itself. The evening brought with it a chill, carrying hints of rain that promised to turn the muddy streets into treacherous pathways. Eliza and her brother huddled in their small room, listening to the faint sounds of the slum preparing for nightfall. The usual noises, the coughs of the sick, the shuffle of boots, the distant arguments, seemed sharper now, as though the events of the day had sharpened perception. Even the rats moved with purpose, scuttling quickly through puddles and debris, reminding anyone watching that life in the slum was a contest of constant vigilance. Across the street, Mr. Crane continued to observe. He had seen enough to understand that Old Nichol Street was about to change. The newcomers were only the beginning. Something else was unfolding, something that might test even the most cunning, the most resilient, and the most desperate residents. And though the street had weathered countless crises, fires, disease, crime, and hunger, it had never faced an uncertainty quite like this. In the shadows, whispered rumors began to spread. Some spoke of people disappearing in the night, of strange lights seen in abandoned buildings, of alliances forming among the desperate that could alter the balance of power. Others speculated that the newcomers were scouts for someone more dangerous, someone who sought to control the slum in ways the residents could not yet see. Every whispered story carried fear. Every story contained a fragment of truth, and every fragment of truth hinted at challenges that were only beginning to take shape. Eliza's eyes remained wide as she imagined what might come. She felt the weight of the slum around her, the narrow walls pressing in, the smell of coal and refuse filling the air, the distant cries that seemed to carry warnings she could not fully interpret. And yet, despite the danger, despite the fear, she felt a spark of determination. Understanding the street, its patterns, and its people was not just survival, it was preparation. And in a place as brutal and unforgiving as Old Nichol Street, preparation could mean the difference between life and death. Night fell fully, and the street seemed to breathe differently. Gas lamps flickered against the mist, casting long, wavering shadows that twisted like living things across the walls and cobblestones. The whispers continued, faint but persistent, and the injured young man remained hidden, watched over by Mrs. Henshaw and a few trusted neighbors. Somewhere in the shadows, the newcomers had vanished, leaving only questions and speculation. And above it all, the quiet, calculating presence of Mr. Crane lingered, reminding everyone that the street's story was far from over. Old Nichol Street had survived centuries of hardship, but it was clear that the coming days, nights, and events would test the residents in ways they had never experienced. Crime, poverty, and disease were constants. Yet now, with the mysterious strangers and the young man's attack, a new kind of tension had been introduced, a force that no one could fully understand, yet all could sense. And as the night deepened and the fog returned, curling like a restless ghost through the alleyways, the street waited, and so did its people, for what was to come. The night settled over Old Nichol Street like a heavy blanket, suffocating yet familiar. The gas lamps, flickering against the fog, threw long, wavering shadows across the cobblestones, making the narrow alleys appear endless. Even those who had grown up here, hardened by years of filth and fear, felt a tension that clung to their bones. Life in the slum was never easy, but tonight it carried the weight of uncertainty, the kind that makes hearts beat faster and eyes dart nervously to every corner. Eliza lay awake in her small room, the sounds of the street drifting through the cracked walls. She listened to the distant shuffle of boots, the faint cries of a child, and the whispered arguments of neighbors settling disputes in the dark. Each noise held meaning, a warning, a signal, or perhaps nothing at all. Yet her mind could not rest. The injured young man, the strangers in the alley, and the whispers of danger had planted seeds of curiosity and dread that would not be silenced. She clutched her brother close, imagining the events that might unfold once the morning arrived. Life in Old Nichol Street was shaped by routine as much as it was by chaos. By day, the alleys thrummed with activity, vendors shouting prices, children chasing rats or each other, women haggling over meager goods, and men arguing over wages, debts, or territory. By night, the street transformed as shadows lengthened and the dangers of the day gave way to those of darkness. Pickpockets, thieves, and mysterious figures whose presence carried unspoken threats. And somewhere among all this, stories unfolded that no official record could ever capture. The raw, unfiltered life of the East End, lived in full, messy detail. Mr. Silas Crane remained a silent observer, moving through the alleys with the precision of someone who had long understood the rhythms of danger. He paused briefly at corners, noting signs invisible to most: a broken board here, a scuff on the wall there, the angle of a shadow, the direction of a faint footprint. Crane had spent years mastering the subtle language of the street, and tonight, his attention was drawn not just to the injured youth or the newcomers, but to something deeper, something hidden in the undercurrent of fear and anticipation that pulsed through the slum. The injured young man, whose name no one yet knew, remained under the care of Mrs. Henshaw. His wounds were modestly tended, but there was a stiffness in his body, a tension that spoke of more than just physical harm. He flinched at sudden sounds, his eyes darting nervously, and even the familiar surroundings offered little comfort. In Old Nichol Street, safety was never guaranteed, and the boy's presence reminded everyone that even the most careful plans could unravel in a moment. Eliza found herself thinking about him constantly. She wondered who he was, where he had come from, and what had brought him to this street. More importantly, she sensed that he held a story, a fragment of truth about the newcomers, or about events yet to come, that no one else had uncovered. Her imagination ran wild with possibilities, blending curiosity with fear. What had he seen? Who had attacked him? And what did the strangers want? The questions twisted in her mind, unanswered and urgent. Meanwhile, the residents of Old Nichol Street continued their daily routines, though now with a subtle tension threading through every action. Laundry still hung on lines between buildings, but women kept a closer watch on children. Men went about work and arguments with extra caution, noting every stranger who passed through the alleys. Even the children, normally fearless and reckless, seemed to move with more awareness, their games quieter, more cautious, as though the street itself had whispered a warning they could not ignore. The history of the East End added depth to the fear and fascination. This was a neighborhood built on survival. Generations of families had lived and died here, hardened by disease, poverty, and crime. Factories spewed smoke into the sky, casting a constant gray pall, while wages barely covered food and rent. Men worked long hours in dangerous conditions. Children labored in workshops or scavenged for coins, and women juggled household chores with selling goods in the street. All of it created a delicate balance. One disruption, one unexpected act, could tip the scales and set off a chain of events no one could predict. Crane's presence reminded everyone of the slum's unspoken hierarchy. He moved like someone who had earned his place not through violence, but through knowledge, observation, and quiet authority. People respected him, not out of fear alone, but because he understood the street better than anyone, and he had the ability to navigate its dangers with unmatched skill. Tonight, however, even Crane's calm demeanor suggested that something was coming, something that could challenge even his careful understanding of the neighborhood. By the next morning, the injured young man had grown more stable, though he remained silent. Mrs. Henshaw, persistent and patient, tried to coax him into speaking, but he offered only vague gestures, shaking his head as though some truths were too dangerous to voice. His silence only deepened the mystery, and among the neighbors, speculation continued to build. What had happened in the alley? Who were the strangers? And why did their brief presence leave such a lingering sense of threat? Even children like Eliza began to notice subtle changes in the street. Routes that were once safe now felt exposed. Certain alleys were avoided, and whispers among adults carried an intensity that was new, even for this neighborhood accustomed to fear. Eliza watched, absorbed, and learned. Each observation was a piece of a puzzle she could not yet fully understand. But she knew that knowledge could mean safety, and perhaps even control, in a place where danger lurked behind every corner. The newcomers remained an enigma. No one knew their names, their intentions, or the reason for their sudden intrusion into the neighborhood. They had vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind only rumors and unanswered questions. And yet, their brief presence seemed to ripple through the street, touching every resident with the subtle knowledge that the balance of power had shifted. Life in Old Nichol Street was never stable, but now it felt as though the very foundation had been unsettled. As the day wore on, the street maintained its rhythm, but tension hung thick in the air. Vendors continued to sell their goods, though with a sharper eye on passers-by. Children moved cautiously, observing and listening, learning lessons in survival faster than any teacher could provide. Men argued quietly over debts and territory, wary of the attention their disputes might attract. And through it all, the fog lingered, curling in alleys and around corners, as if the street itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next event to unfold. Eliza returned to the alley where the attack had occurred, drawn by curiosity and a sense of purpose. She observed the faint footprints, the scuff marks on the walls, and the shadows that stretched unnaturally in the afternoon light. Every detail was a clue, every observation a step toward understanding the danger that had intruded into her world. Her brother followed, cautious but trusting, understanding that her instincts often saved them from harm. Together, they began piecing together fragments of a story no one had yet dared to tell. By nightfall, Old Nichol Street had settled into its usual rhythm of darkness and muted activity, but the undercurrent of anxiety remained. Gas lamps flickered in the fog, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed almost alive. The injured young man lay quietly, observed by Mrs. Henshaw and a few trusted neighbors, while Mr. Crane watched from the shadows, taking in every movement and gesture. And somewhere in the distance, unseen but felt, the strangers who had visited the street continued to influence the tension, their presence a silent reminder that Old Nichol Street was far from ordinary, and that events in the coming days could challenge every resident's strength, cunning, and endurance. The slum, with all its filth, danger, and humanity, was preparing to reveal more of its secrets. The residents felt it, even if they could not yet articulate it. Old Nichol Street had endured countless hardships, yet the mysteries and threats of the present promised challenges unlike any before. And as the fog deepened once again, curling through the alleys and around the flickering gas lamps, it became clear that this was only the beginning, an introduction to a story that would reveal the brutal, unrelenting, and deeply human reality of life in Victorian London's East End. The morning after the strange events felt heavier than usual, as though Old Nichol Street itself had absorbed the fear from the previous night. Even the air seemed thicker, hanging low with a damp chill that crept into clothes and bones. People stepped outside with guarded expressions, glancing around as though expecting someone or something to appear from the fog. It was the kind of day when anything could happen, and the slum knew it. Eliza walked carefully, her brother clinging to her hand. The street was waking up, but slowly, almost reluctantly. Women with shawls wrapped tightly around their shoulders swept doorsteps with quick, nervous motions. Older men gathered near the corner, speaking in hushed voices that carried a tone of warning. Children watched from doorways instead of running freely into the alleys. It was as if the entire neighborhood shared an unspoken understanding that the peace, thin and fragile as it was, had been disturbed. Mrs. Henshaw was already outside, her apron still dusted with flour. She had barely slept. The injured young man had spent most of the night shifting restlessly, murmuring in his sleep, terrified even in dreams. She waved Eliza over with a worried expression. "He's awake," she whispered, "but still jumpy. He keeps looking over his shoulder, like he expects someone to burst in." She paused. "There's something he's not saying." Eliza nodded. She had sensed that from the start. The boy was not just scared. He was hiding something. And whatever it wasn't small. She asked if she could see him, and Mrs. Henshaw agreed, but warned her to be gentle. The room was dim, lit only by morning light pushing through dirty curtains. The boy sat on the bed, shoulders hunched, hands trembling in his lap. He looked up at Eliza with wary eyes, the kind that had seen too much. She approached slowly, keeping her voice soft, almost like speaking to a wounded animal. "You're safe here," she said. His lips pressed together, as though he wanted to believe her, but couldn't. He tried to speak, the effort visible in the tightness of his jaw, but no words came. Instead, he shook his head and looked toward the window, watching the fog move past like drifting ghosts. Eliza didn't push him. She simply sat nearby, letting the silence settle. She knew from experience, growing up in Old Nichol taught you more about people than any book, that silence could be more comforting than words. But as she sat there, she noticed something. The boy wasn't just afraid. He was listening. Every sound, a cartwheel hitting a stone, a dog barking, footsteps in the hallway, made him tense. Whoever he feared wasn't just in his memory. They might still be close. Meanwhile, outside the house, Mr. Crane stood with his hands behind his back, watching the street. Nothing escaped his notice. Not the movement of shadows, not the way neighbors exchanged worried glances, not the faint footprints still visible in the alley where the boy had been found. He moved with purpose, but without hurry, observing the slum as though it were a living map. He noticed a small group of men gathered near the old pub, their eyes darting around. They weren't regulars. Their boots were too clean, their coats too new, and they carried themselves with a sense of quiet authority that didn't belong here. Crane watched from a distance, blending into the fog like a figure carved from shadow. He knew better than to confront strangers. He preferred to learn first. The men spoke quietly among themselves, one pointing toward the direction of Mrs. Henshaw's house. Crane felt a knot tighten in his chest. Whoever these men were, they weren't here for casual wanderings. Their purpose was sharp, clear, and dangerous. And if they were looking in that direction, the connection was obvious. The boy. Crane moved away before they noticed him, his steps silent on the damp cobblestones. He had been right. Something had entered the slum, something that didn't belong. And he needed to find out what before it swallowed Old Nichol Street whole. Back inside, Eliza continued watching the boy. When she finally spoke again, he responded with a small nod, as though he appreciated the calm she brought into the room. She asked simple questions, his name, where he came from, if he had family. Each question hung in the air, unanswered. But then, slowly, almost unwillingly, he whispered something. It wasn't a name. It wasn't a story. It was just one word, trembling and barely audible. "They're coming." Eliza froze. Her brother looked up at her, eyes wide, sensing the fear in the boy's voice. She asked him who he meant, but he shook his head violently, pressing his hands to his face as though he regretted speaking. Mrs. Henshaw stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "No one's getting to you here," she said. "Not while you're under my roof." But her words did little to ease the tension. The boy curled inward, trembling. Moments later, Mr. Crane knocked on the door. Mrs. Henshaw let him in immediately, recognizing the urgency in his eyes. Crane spoke quietly, but his tone carried weight. "We have visitors in the slum," he said. "Men who don't belong here." The boy's head jerked up, his eyes wide with terror. That was enough for Crane to know he was right. Eliza felt the atmosphere shift, as though the room itself had inhaled sharply. Her brother clutched her side, sensing the danger without understanding it. Crane looked at the boy with steady patience. "If you want protection, you must speak. Who are these men?" But again, the boy stayed silent. Fear held him like a tight rope around his throat. Crane didn't press. Instead, he turned to Mrs. Henshaw. "He can stay hidden here for now," he said. "But it won't be long before they start asking questions." Mrs. Henshaw nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. She had taken in many children and strangers over the years, but this felt different. This felt bigger. After Crane left, Eliza stood by the window watching him disappear into the fog. She felt a strange mix of fear and determination rising inside her. She didn't know who the strange men were or why they wanted the boy, but she knew the slum well enough to understand that danger didn't simply pass by. It settled, lingered, and grew. The rest of the day moved slowly, every moment thick with unease. Rumors spread through Old Nichol like sparks through dry straw. Whispers of outsiders, of trouble, of something coming. Even those who didn't know the details felt the tension settling into their bones. And as evening approached, the fog thickened once more, swallowing the rooftops and creeping through the alleys. Light from the gas lamps blurred into soft halos, turning the street into an eerie, shifting dream. Children were called indoors early. Doors locked a little faster. Conversations hushed when footsteps echoed too close. Eliza stood outside for a moment, breathing in the cool air. She felt as though the slum was holding its breath again, just as it had the night before. Somewhere in the fog, something moved, a shape, a shadow, maybe just a trick of the light. But Eliza felt it. Deep inside, someone was watching. Someone was searching. And the faint sound of boots approaching from the direction of the main road told her the strangers were getting closer. Closer than anyone in Old Nichol wanted. The fragile calm of the slum was about to break again. And the real story, the dangerous one, was only beginning. The fog thickened as night crept over Old Nichol Street, swallowing colors and shapes until everything blended into one long stretch of gray. Windows glowed faintly behind thin curtains, but the light did little to push back the heaviness outside. The slum had endured bad nights before, yet this one felt different, like the start of something larger, something that stretched beyond the narrow alleys and cramped rooms. Eliza felt the change in the air as she hurried back to Mrs. Henshaw's house. She kept glancing over her shoulder, almost certain she heard footsteps behind her, though every time she turned, the street was empty. Her brother, usually chatty even in the dark, stayed quiet, clinging to her arm. The tension was teaching him silence faster than any warning could. Inside, the lamps were dimmed, and the atmosphere felt tight, as though the house itself understood the danger. The boy sat near the fire, his thin frame shivering despite the warmth. Mrs. Henshaw offered him tea, but he barely touched it, staring into the flames like they carried memories he wished he could erase. Eliza watched him, noticing every flinch, every sharp breath. She wondered what had brought him here, what fear had chased him into the heart of Old Nichol Street. Mr. Crane arrived a little later, his face set in that controlled way of his. He didn't push the door open quickly or slam it shut. He entered with quiet confidence, as though sudden movements might attract unwanted attention. When his eyes landed on the boy, he gave a small nod, confirming his suspicion that danger was closer than any of them wanted to believe. "They're searching the perimeter," Crane said softly. Not loudly, not openly. "They're careful men." Mrs. Henshaw's hands tightened around her apron. "What do they want with a child?" Crane shook his head. "Not just any child. That boy saw something, or knows something. Men like that don't move through a place like ours unless they're hunting." The boy's eyes widened, and he sank deeper into the chair. Eliza stepped closer, trying to offer comfort without forcing it. She sensed he wanted to speak, but the words felt trapped under layers of fear. From outside, faint sounds drifted in, boots, distant voices, the grind of wheels on cobblestones. Nothing unusual for the East End, yet tonight every noise carried a different tone, like each sound was part of a message the slum needed to interpret. Crane moved toward the window and pushed the curtain slightly aside. The fog blurred the street, but he could still see a shape moving near the corner. One of the strangers, boots too polished, posture too straight, too alert to belong here. "They're looking for a house," Crane murmured. Eliza felt her pulse quicken. Across the slum, meanwhile, life went on in its own anxious rhythm. A group of factory workers staggered home, coughing from smoke and fatigue. A mother carried water from the pump, stopping every few steps to rest. A pair of older children argued quietly over a loaf of bread. But beneath their struggles, the same subtle tension ran through everything. Old Nichol felt like a living thing bracing for impact. Subplots began weaving themselves through the main conflict. Word spread of a missing ledger from a nearby workshop, one that recorded illegal trades, unpaid wages, and names of those responsible. Some believed the strangers were searching for that ledger. Others whispered of an inspector who had gone missing last week after asking too many questions. And a few, those who lived longest in the slum and trusted no one, believed the strangers belonged to a group that preferred to work away from the public eye. And somewhere in the middle of these overlapping rumors sat the injured boy, silent and tense, as though he carried a piece of truth no one else had. In another corner of the slum, an elderly man named Bramley sat outside his crumbling doorway. His failing sight made him rely on sound more than most. He heard the strangers before anyone else did. The heavy steps, the controlled breathing, the way they whispered instructions rather than shouted orders. He knew trouble when it stepped within 3 feet of him. Tonight, he listened carefully, leaning on his cane as strangers passed by, oblivious to the fact that someone was quietly observing them from the shadows of age and poverty. He tapped softly on the wall near him, a signal meant for Crane. It was an old rhythm, one that only a handful of people in the slum still recognized. Crane heard it instantly and nodded at the window. "They've spread out," Crane said, "and they're not leaving." The words hung heavy in the air. Eliza looked toward the boy. "We need to know why." The boy opened his mouth but froze again. His hands trembled so violently that Mrs. Henshaw knelt beside him. "No one here will harm you," she whispered. "Not a soul." After a long moment, the boy lifted his gaze. His voice shook when he finally found the courage to speak. "They're not after a ledger," he said. "They're after something I saw, something I heard." Crane leaned closer, his expression steady but urgent. "What?" The boy swallowed. "A meeting. Men speaking about money. About a plan. Something big. They didn't know I was there." Eliza felt the air tighten. "What kind of plan?" Crane pressed gently. The boy shook his head. "I don't know. I only heard pieces. But they said something about the East End. About making things disappear. And if they know I saw them, they won't stop." Silence fell over the room like a thick curtain. Crane exhaled slowly. This wasn't just a case of someone fleeing trouble. This was bigger. Dangerous. Connected to forces that operated outside the slum's fragile world. Outside, a soft knock echoed down the street. A pattern too deliberate to be random, too sharp to be friendly. The fog carried the sound, amplifying it. Someone was checking doors. One by one, Eliza moved to the back of the room, pulling her brother close. Mrs. Henshaw stood near the doorway, her face pale but determined. The boy's breathing grew shallow as he searched for a place to hide. Crane held up a hand. "Stay quiet." The knocks moved closer, slow and patient. Someone was searching methodically, as if they had all night to uncover what they wanted. In houses nearby, families froze. Conversation stopped. A candle blew out. Even the dogs quieted. The entire slum sensed danger moving from doorstep to doorstep. Crane positioned himself between the door and the rest of the room. His face was calm, but the tightness around his eyes revealed the truth. He knew the strangers would find this house sooner or later. Eliza watched the doorknob, her breath caught in her chest. The knocking stopped. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, a shadow passed across the window. The boy whimpered softly. Crane didn't move. He waited, listening, watching the silhouette linger outside like someone marking their next step. And then, just as quietly as it arrived, the shadow slipped back into the fog. For now, no one spoke for a long moment. Every person in the room understood what the stranger's silence meant. They hadn't given up. They had only begun their search. And Old Nichol Street, unprotected and forgotten by the city beyond it, was about to be pulled into a conflict much larger than anything the slum had seen in years. The tension thickened again, weaving into the walls, into the streets, into the people themselves. Nothing was resolved. Nothing was safe. And the danger was still closing in. The wind along the docks picked up just enough to make the ropes slap softly against the metal railings, a reminder of how close everything felt to slipping out of control. Rebecca stood at the edge, hands tucked into her jacket pockets, watching the slow movement of lights across the water. She couldn't shake the feeling that every step they took only led them deeper into something far older and more complicated than any single case. Navarro joined her a moment later, his footsteps quiet, his voice even quieter as he asked if she was still thinking about the symbol burned into the last victim's belongings. She nodded, because how could she not be? That single mark seemed to appear everywhere now, like a silent thread weaving through every part of their investigation. He told her he kept replaying the moment Jeremy's trail went cold again, how it felt as if they weren't dealing with a man anymore, but with a shadow that chose when to be seen. Rebecca admitted she felt the same, and even though they were trained to break things down logically, something about this case refused to fit inside any box they knew. Navarro leaned against the railing, eyes on the dark waves, and wondered out loud if maybe the network they were chasing wasn't just protecting Jeremy, but creating him, shaping him, using him. Rebecca didn't answer right away. She didn't want to say it, but she'd been thinking that for days. They walked back toward the pier office where Agent Ruiz was waiting with a new set of files. She had that tired but sharp look, the kind that said she had found something important but didn't quite know what to make of it yet. She slid the papers across the small desk, pointing to a list of names that had been encrypted in an old archive database no agency claimed ownership of. Each name belonged to someone who had vanished under strange circumstances, some as far back as the 70s. Every one of them had a connection to the same abandoned research facility the team had visited earlier in the investigation. Navarro felt a chill climb up his spine when he noticed one more thing. Each name had a date next to it, and the dates matched the years of Jeremy's known disappearances and reappearances. Rebecca ran her thumb across the page, trying to make sense of it. Ruiz explained that the entries were labeled as cycles, and that after each cycle, a new name appeared while another was marked inactive. Navarro asked what inactive meant, but Ruiz didn't answer because the possibilities were already sitting heavily between them. Rebecca studied the list again and noticed that one name had no inactivity date. It belonged to someone classified only as Subject 12. She whispered it without thinking, and Ruiz immediately told her that this name tied back into the strange encounter they had at the facility, the boy who hadn't aged. Navarro asked if it was possible the child they saw was connected to whatever this cycle system represented. Rebecca said it was more than possible. It was the only thing that felt like it made sense anymore. The tension thickened as they went through old reports, missing persons cases, unauthorized transfers. Every document feeding a theory none of them wanted to say out loud. Navarro finally broke the silence by suggesting they take a trip to see the retired doctor who used to work at the facility decades ago. Rebecca agreed, saying they couldn't afford to lose momentum. Ruiz stayed behind to keep digging through encrypted files. As Rebecca and Navarro drove through the outskirts of the city, rain tapped lightly on the windshield, creating a steady rhythm that almost masked the unease settling in the car. The doctor lived in a quiet, aging neighborhood where the houses sat close together, almost leaning on each other. His porch light flickered, as if unsure whether it wanted to stay on. Rebecca knocked on the door, and after a long pause, a frail voice called out, asking who they were. Navarro gave their names and said they needed to talk about the facility and about an old patient listed as Subject 12. The door opened slowly, only a few inches at first, until the elderly man's narrowed eyes softened with recognition of the name, not of them. He invited them inside, though his hands trembled slightly as he motioned toward the living room. The house smelled faintly of old paper and tea. The doctor lowered himself into a chair and asked why they were looking for information so dangerous. Rebecca didn't hesitate to tell him they were trying to stop something before more people got hurt. The doctor closed his eyes for a moment, then said that the facility had been built on a promise of medical advancement, but was twisted by people who wanted control instead of healing. He told them about children who had been brought there as part of an experiment designed to slow aging and heighten certain cognitive functions. Navarro exchanged a look with Rebecca. This lined up too perfectly with what they had seen. The doctor explained that Subject 12 was unique. The experiments didn't just slow his aging, they nearly halted it. But the more they tried to study him, the more unpredictable things became. Some staff believed that Subject 12's presence influenced the emotional states of people around him, almost like an echo or resonance. Rebecca asked where the boy came from, but the doctor shook his head, saying he never knew. The child had simply appeared one day, escorted by men who never spoke their names. Navarro asked if Jeremy was one of the early test subjects too, but the doctor hesitated, then admitted he had seen a young man who resembled Jeremy in the facility long before the official timeline of Jeremy's crimes began. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. If Jeremy had been part of the experiments, then his long periods of disappearance and reappearance made sense in a way nothing else had. Navarro leaned forward, asking if the cycles matched experiment phases. The doctor said yes, and then whispered something that made both agents sit back. Each cycle required one subject to remain stable while another was introduced. Stability often meant survival. Introduction often did not. Rebecca's stomach turned at the implication. Navarro's hand tightened into a fist. Before they could ask more, the doctor grew nervous and said he'd already said too much. He warned them that the network behind the project wasn't gone. It had simply gone underground, waiting until attention faded. Rebecca asked why he had decided to talk at all. The doctor looked at her with tired, haunted eyes and said because he had lived with the guilt long enough. Rebecca thanked him, even though she knew leaving him behind weighed heavily on her conscience. Outside, the rain had picked up, coming down harder now, almost washing the street in silver. Navarro asked what she was thinking. Rebecca said she felt like they were chasing not just a criminal, but a legacy, one built on hidden experiments, forgotten children, and people who were never supposed to exist. Navarro said they needed to get back to Ruiz, especially now that they knew the cycles weren't random. Rebecca agreed, but she also felt something else brewing, something personal. She didn't say it out loud. Not yet, but she kept thinking about the way Subject 12 had looked at her at the facility. Not scared, not curious, almost aware. They drove back in silence, each lost in their thoughts, the tension growing with every mile. None of the main conflicts were closer to being resolved. If anything, everything had become more tangled, more dangerous, more human. And as the city lights came into view, Rebecca knew one thing for certain. Whatever they were about to uncover next would change everything they thought they understood about the case, about Jeremy, and about the mysterious child who refused to age. Rebecca barely spoke during the drive back, her fingers tapping lightly against her knee, a habit Navarro recognized as a sign she was stacking pieces of a puzzle in her mind, waiting for the one that would make everything click. The rain had softened into a mist, drifting across the windshield like smoke. Navarro kept glancing at her, trying to read what she wasn't saying. When he finally asked, she whispered that she felt they were being pulled towards something huge, something none of them were prepared for. Navarro didn't argue. He felt it too. Every new clue only seemed to open another door they didn't realize existed. When they reached the field office, Ruiz was already pacing, clutching a printed stack of decrypted files. Her eyes widened with relief and urgency when she saw them. She motioned them into the conference room and closed the door behind them. It was clear she had uncovered something big, something that tied everything together even tighter. She spread the pages out on the table, and there it was, the connection they'd been looking for but weren't ready to face. The cycles were not isolated experiments. They were part of an ongoing protocol, still active under a different name, run through shell companies scattered across several states. Rebecca leaned in closer, reading the words twice, then a third time, just to be sure her mind wasn't bending the truth to fit her fears. There were logistics entries showing movement of carriers, assets, and return subjects. Navarro pointed to one line that mentioned an unscheduled retrieval 4 months ago, the same month Jeremy had resurfaced. Another note listed primary anchor, next to the entry for Subject 12. Ruiz added that the term anchor showed up in early research notes, describing a stabilizing source needed to maintain long-term psychological and physiological balance in modified subjects. Rebecca swallowed hard. If Subject 12 was an anchor, it meant Jeremy's connection to him wasn't accidental. It was engineered. Navarro stepped back from the table, hands on his hips, tension rolling off him like heat. He said it out loud, because someone had to. Jeremy wasn't just a fugitive they were chasing. He was part of a system designed to activate, disappear, and return on a schedule someone else controlled. And if that was true, it meant Jeremy might be trying to break free of the same people who created him. Ruiz pulled up security footage from a remote storage site linked to the shell companies. The feed was grainy, but recognizable. Jeremy entering a warehouse, alone, moving like someone who knew exactly where he was going. Rebecca's breath caught. Jeremy wasn't running from them. He was searching for something, or someone. Navarro asked Ruiz to enhance the still frame, where Jeremy paused near an old crate. When she zoomed in, they could all see it. The same symbol burned into past evidence, etched faintly into the crate's surface. The realization hit them all at once. The symbol wasn't a threat. It was a marker, a way for the subjects, or the people controlling them, to track cycles, transitions, and movements. The crates might contain documents, equipment, or something more dangerous. Ruiz said she traced the warehouse to a property still owned, quietly, by the same group that ran the original facility decades earlier. Rebecca knew what that meant. Someone was preparing for another cycle, and Jeremy was trying to interrupt it. They needed to get to the warehouse before anyone else did, especially if Subject 12 was involved. Rebecca grabbed her coat, Navarro already moving, Ruiz right behind them with her laptop in hand. Traffic was thin as they sped through the outskirts toward the industrial district. Navarro kept checking the side mirrors, convinced they were being followed. Rebecca didn't dismiss the worry. It felt like eyes had been on them for days. As they approached the warehouse, Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. The area was too quiet. No security trucks, no staff, no movement, just a cold stillness hanging over the lot. Navarro cut the engine and listened. Nothing, not even the wind, seemed willing to cross the space. Rebecca motioned for them to move in carefully. They raised their flashlights and approached the side door, which hung slightly open, as if someone left in a hurry. Inside, the air was heavy, stale, carrying a faint metallic smell. Their light beams swept across rows of crates, old machinery, and scattered papers. Rebecca felt the hairs rise on her arms. Navarro whispered that it felt wrong, like they were walking into a moment someone else had planned for them. Ruiz scanned with her tablet, tracking heat signatures, but everything came back cold. No sign of recent activity, until she spotted one faint reading near the back corner, small, steady, like a heartbeat. They moved toward it carefully, weaving through crates and metal shelving. The closer they got, the stronger the tension grew. Navarro tightened his grip on his flashlight, ready for anything. Rebecca's chest felt tight, anticipation and unease mixing until she could barely tell one from the other. When they reached the source of the heat signature, Ruiz pointed to a large crate with the symbol burned deep into the wood. It was newer, sharper than the markings they'd seen before. Rebecca pressed her palm to the crate. Warm, not from the room, from something inside. Navarro began prying the lid open, inch by inch, until a soft hiss sounded and a faint, cool vapor drifted upward. Rebecca stepped back as the lid loosened, revealing a small chamber inside. And there, lying perfectly still, wrapped in a thin thermal blanket, was someone about the size of a young child. Rebecca's breath shattered. It wasn't Subject 12. It was another child, a different one, eyes closed, chest rising slowly, as if in some deep, controlled sleep. Ruiz whispered that the tag attached to the blanket didn't match any known records. It read Subject 13, followed by a date only a few months old. Navarro cursed under his breath. Rebecca felt everything inside her clench. If there was a 13, then the cycles hadn't just continued, they had expanded. Rebecca reached out, brushing her fingertips lightly across the blanket. The child didn't stir, but she felt a faint warmth radiating outward. It wasn't natural. It wasn't normal. It was the same kind of presence she felt when Subject 12 had looked at her, like something inside them was aware of more than anyone understood. Suddenly, a noise echoed from the far end of the warehouse. A sharp, metallic click followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. They froze. Navarro raised his light toward the noise. Ruiz clutched her laptop. Rebecca's breath came shallow, her heart drumming in her ears. The footsteps grew louder, steadier, not rushed, not panicked, confident, like someone who had been waiting for them. Rebecca whispered for Navarro to take the left and Ruiz to stay behind her. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then resumed, coming closer, echoing against the concrete. Rebecca raised her light, stepping forward, pulse hammering, every nerve tightening. The shadows shifted at the end of the corridor of crates, forming the outline of a figure. Tall, familiar, moving with careful precision. Navarro whispered a single name under his breath. Jeremy. But Rebecca wasn't convinced. The way the figure stood, the stillness, the quiet, it felt different. As if Jeremy wasn't alone, or as if this person wasn't coming to confront them, but to warn them. The figure stepped forward into the thin rays of light, lifting a hand slowly, fingers spread as if signaling them to stop. Rebecca's breath caught, suspended between terror and understanding as the moment stretched, taut, fragile, and seconds away from shattering into the climax they were hurtling toward. Everything finally converging, everything about to collide. Rebecca barely spoke during the drive back, her fingers tapping lightly against her knee, a habit Navarro recognized as a sign she was stacking pieces of a puzzle in her mind, waiting for the one that would make everything click. The rain had softened into a mist, drifting across the windshield like smoke. Navarro kept glancing at her, trying to read what she wasn't saying. When he finally asked, she whispered that she felt they were being pulled towards something huge, something none of them were prepared for. Navarro didn't argue. He felt it too. Every new clue only seemed to open another door they didn't realize existed. When they reached the field office, Ruiz was already pacing, clutching a printed stack of decrypted files. Her eyes widened with relief and urgency when she saw them. She motioned them into the conference room and closed the door behind them. It was clear she had uncovered something big, something that tied everything together even tighter. She spread the pages out on the table, and there it was, the connection they'd been looking for but weren't ready to face. The cycles were not isolated experiments. They were part of an ongoing protocol, still active under a different name, run through shell companies scattered across several states. Rebecca leaned in closer, reading the words twice, then a third time, just to be sure her mind wasn't bending the truth to fit her fears. There were logistics entries showing movement of carriers, assets, and return subjects. Navarro pointed to one line that mentioned an unscheduled retrieval 4 months ago, the same month Jeremy had resurfaced. Another note listed primary anchor, next to the entry for Subject 12. Ruiz added that the term anchor showed up in early research notes, describing a stabilizing source needed to maintain long-term psychological and physiological balance in modified subjects. Rebecca swallowed hard. If Subject 12 was an anchor, it meant Jeremy's connection to him wasn't accidental. It was engineered. Navarro stepped back from the table, hands on his hips, tension rolling off him like heat. He said it out loud, because someone had to. Jeremy wasn't just a fugitive they were chasing. He was part of a system designed to activate, disappear, and return on a schedule someone else controlled. And if that was true, it meant Jeremy might be trying to break free of the same people who created him. Ruiz pulled up security footage from a remote storage site linked to the shell companies. The feed was grainy, but recognizable. Jeremy entering a warehouse, alone, moving like someone who knew exactly where he was going. Rebecca's breath caught. Jeremy wasn't running from them. He was searching for something, or someone. Navarro asked Ruiz to enhance the still frame where Jeremy paused near an old crate. When she zoomed in, they could all see it. The same symbol burned into past evidence, etched faintly into the crate's surface. The realization hit them all at once. The symbol wasn't a threat. It was a marker, a way for the subjects, or the people controlling them, to track cycles, transitions, and movements. The crates might contain documents, equipment, or something more dangerous. Ruiz said she traced the warehouse to a property still owned, quietly, by the same group that ran the original facility decades earlier. Rebecca knew what that meant. Someone was preparing for another cycle, and Jeremy was trying to interrupt it. They needed to get to the warehouse before anyone else did, especially if Subject 12 was involved. Rebecca grabbed her coat, Navarro already moving, Ruiz right behind them with her laptop in hand. Traffic was thin as they sped through the outskirts toward the industrial district. Navarro kept checking the side mirrors, convinced they were being followed. Rebecca didn't dismiss the worry. It felt like eyes had been on them for days. As they approached the warehouse, Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. The area was too quiet. No security trucks, no staff, no movement, just a cold stillness hanging over the lot. Navarro cut the engine and listened. Nothing. Not even the wind seemed willing to cross the space. Rebecca motioned for them to move in carefully. They raised their flashlights and approached the side door, which hung slightly open, as if someone left in a hurry. Inside, the air was heavy, stale, carrying a faint metallic smell. Their light beams swept across rows of crates, old machinery, and scattered papers. Rebecca felt the hairs rise on her arms. Navarro whispered that it felt wrong, like they were walking into a moment someone else had planned for them. Ruiz scanned with her tablet, tracking heat signatures, but everything came back cold. No sign of recent activity, until she spotted one faint reading near the back corner, small, steady, like a heartbeat. They moved toward it carefully, weaving through crates and metal shelving. The closer they got, the stronger the tension grew. Navarro tightened his grip on his flashlight, ready for anything. Rebecca's chest felt tight, anticipation and unease mixing until she could barely tell one from the other. When they reached the source of the heat signature, Ruiz pointed to a large crate with the symbol burned deep into the wood. It was newer, sharper than the markings they'd seen before. Rebecca pressed her palm to the crate. Warm. Not from the room, from something inside. Navarro began prying the lid open, inch by inch, until a soft hiss sounded and a faint, cool vapor drifted upward. Rebecca stepped back as the lid loosened, revealing a small chamber inside. And there, lying perfectly still, wrapped in a thin thermal blanket, was someone about the size of a young child. Rebecca's breath shattered. It wasn't Subject 12. It was another child. A different one. Eyes closed, chest rising slowly, as if in some deep, controlled sleep. Ruiz whispered that the tag attached to the blanket didn't match any known records. It read Subject 13, followed by a date only a few months old. Navarro cursed under his breath. Rebecca felt everything inside her clench. If there was a 13, then the cycles hadn't just continued. They had expanded. Rebecca reached out, brushing her fingertips lightly across the blanket. The child didn't stir, but she felt a faint warmth radiating outward. It wasn't natural. It wasn't normal. It was the same kind of presence she felt when Subject 12 had looked at her, like something inside them was aware of more than anyone understood. Suddenly, a noise echoed from the far end of the warehouse. A sharp, metallic click followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. They froze. Navarro raised his light toward the noise. Ruiz clutched her laptop. Rebecca's breath came shallow, her heart drumming in her ears. The footsteps grew louder, steadier, not rushed, not panicked, confident, like someone who had been waiting for them. Rebecca whispered for Navarro to take the left and Ruiz to stay behind her. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then resumed, coming closer, echoing against the concrete. Rebecca raised her light, stepping forward, pulse hammering, every nerve tightening. The shadows shifted at the end of the corridor of crates, forming the outline of a figure. Tall, familiar, moving with careful precision. Navarro whispered a single name under his breath. Jeremy. But Rebecca wasn't convinced. The way the figure stood, the stillness, the quiet, it felt different. As if Jeremy wasn't alone, or as if this person wasn't coming to confront them, but to warn them. The figure stepped forward into the thin rays of light, lifting a hand slowly, fingers spread as if signaling them to stop. Rebecca's breath caught, suspended between terror and understanding, as the moment stretched, taut, fragile, and seconds away from shattering into the climax they were hurtling toward. Everything finally converging. Everything about to collide. Subject 13 didn't move at first. It only stared at Rebecca with those bright, unnervingly calm eyes, eyes that held none of the confusion or fear a normal child would have after waking up in a strange place. Instead, it watched her like someone remembering a face from some long-buried memory. Rebecca felt her chest tighten, her feet rooted to the ground even as every instinct screamed for her to step back. Navarro shifted slightly, putting himself between her and the child, but 13's gaze didn't waver. It wasn't looking at Navarro. It wasn't looking at Ruiz or Elias. It was looking only at her. Then it blinked, slow and deliberate, like it had made a decision. Elias whispered that this shouldn't be happening, that 13 wasn't supposed to activate without a command. His voice trembled in a way that made it clear he was genuinely afraid. Ruiz's device started beeping again, picking up sudden fluctuations in temperature and movement. Navarro raised a hand for silence, listening for anything else in the warehouse, but the only sound was the soft hum coming from a crate. 13 sat up, not quickly, not like a startled child. It moved gently, almost gracefully, lowering its feet over the edge of the crate. The thermal blanket slid off its shoulders and pooled on the floor. Thin, small, but steady, like someone stepping into a role they had been trained for. Rebecca couldn't look away. There was something strangely familiar about the child's posture, something that tugged at a memory she didn't realize she had. 13 tilted its head slightly, still watching her. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, it said her name. Rebecca. Not a question, not an echo, a certainty. Navarro swore under his breath. Ruiz looked stunned. Elias took several steps back, panic creeping down his spine. He muttered that 13 shouldn't know any names except for its handlers. Rebecca felt a wave of cold wash over her. She hadn't even introduced herself to the child. She asked quietly how 13 knew her, but the child only blinked again, as if the answer was too simple to need words. Elias suddenly grabbed Navarro's arm, urging him to move everyone away. But before they could step back, 13 lifted one small hand and pointed toward the far end of the warehouse. Rebecca turned instinctively, her flashlight beam cutting through the rows of crates. Someone was there, a shadowed figure, barely visible, standing so still it blended into the darkness. Navarro pushed Rebecca behind him, and Ruiz raised her device, trying to analyze the movement. The figure stepped forward just enough for the dim light to catch the outline of a face. Rebecca's breath caught again. It wasn't Jeremy. It was Subject 12, still young, still unchanged, still carrying that strange stillness, as if time didn't apply to him at all. His presence alone made the air feel heavier, pulling everyone's nerves tight. He stood there, expression unreadable, eyes flicking from 13 to Rebecca, then briefly to Elias. Rebecca whispered his name, unsure if he remembered her. But something in his eyes shifted, softening just slightly, as if he did. Slow, steady footsteps echoed as he moved closer. Navarro raised his hand in warning, but 12 didn't react. He stopped a few feet away and looked at 13 as if assessing it. Elias stepped forward, voice shaking, telling 12 he couldn't be here, that the moment they were both active together, the system would trigger a recall. 12 didn't break eye contact with 13. He lifted his chin slightly and spoke his first words since the day he'd vanished. Too late. Rebecca froze. Elias's face drained of color. Navarro clenched his jaw. Ruiz checked her device again and swore. Something in the network had clicked on, an encrypted signal bouncing across multiple inactive sites. A recall. A retrieval order. Something had awakened because of 12 and 13 being in the same place at the same time. Rebecca asked 12 what he meant, but he didn't answer her. Instead, he turned toward the exit door, eyes sharp, alert. He told them they needed to leave now, before the handlers arrived. Elias shook his head in disbelief, saying the recall shouldn't activate without direct authorization. 12 glanced back at him, and for the first time, Rebecca saw a flicker of fear in his expression. They found Jeremy. The words hit Rebecca like a blow. Navarro went still, jaw tightening. Ruiz's fingers halted over her keyboard. Rebecca stepped closer, asking what happened, where Jeremy was. 12 shook his head, saying Jeremy had tried to stop the activation, but had failed. The creators had taken him back, not to reintegrate him into the system, but to extract something from him, something he'd stolen. Rebecca asked what Jeremy had taken. The answer came not from 12, but from 13. A memory. Rebecca stiffened. Elias whispered that subjects weren't supposed to keep memories between cycles. They were wiped clean to keep them stable. 12 nodded, confirming Jeremy had somehow held on to one, something the creators desperately wanted back. Rebecca asked what the memory was. 12 didn't speak. Instead, he stepped closer to Rebecca, close enough that she could see the strange glow shifting in his eyes. He told her that the memory was about her. Something Jeremy had seen. Something he wasn't supposed to know. Rebecca's pulse hammered at her throat. Navarro moved closer protectively. Elias ran a shaky hand through his hair, muttering that this changed everything. Ruiz's device beeped again, louder, faster. She said multiple thermal signatures were approaching the warehouse. More than 5. More than 10. A retrieval unit. 12 grabbed Rebecca's hand. Not forcefully, but urgently, telling her they needed to leave before the handlers reached them. 13 stepped off the crate silently and came to her side, like it already knew where it needed to be. Navarro whispered that they had no exit routes besides the main door and the loading dock. Ruiz said the loading dock might be their only chance, but they had seconds at most. Elias looked toward 12 with a hopeless expression, asking if they could fight. 12 shook his head. You don't fight them. You run. Rebecca hesitated. Every instinct said she couldn't leave without knowing what Jeremy's memory was, what he had seen that changed the course of everything. But 12 squeezed her hand gently and said the memory would find her, if she survived long enough to reach the next cycle. Before she could ask what that meant, a loud metallic clang echoed through the warehouse. Navarro swung his light toward the entrance. Figures were moving in. 10, 15, forming a wall of silhouettes. Rebecca felt her heart plummet. 12 pulled her backward. 13 pressed against her side. Navarro readied himself. Ruiz clutched her device. Elias whispered, "They're here," and the warehouse doors slammed fully open, flooding the room with blinding white light. The next morning began with a quiet that felt almost unnatural. After everything that had happened, the surveillance, the confessions, the sting operations, the late-night confrontations, it was hard for anyone involved to believe that the storm had finally passed. But as the sun came up and spread a soft gold across the city, it felt like a curtain slowly lowering over a long, exhausting show. Everyone was worn out, everyone was changed, and everyone was ready to understand what the whole journey had meant. Rebecca walked into the federal building with a calm she hadn't felt in months. The tension that once lived in her shoulders was gone, replaced by something steadier, deeper, a sense of closure. Navarro was already inside, leaning against the conference table, a coffee in his hand, and an expression that was halfway between relief and disbelief. "You sleep?" he asked. "Somehow," she said, dropping her bag onto the chair. "You, 3 hours. That still counts, right?" She smiled because that was the closest thing to normal they had shared in weeks. The rest of the investigative team filtered in, each carrying files, laptops, and the last pieces of evidence needed to finalize the report that would close the entire operation. There were no arguments, no frantic calls, no unexpected alarms. Just people doing the final work of tying loose ends, writing statements, filing charges, and making sure the truth, every piece of it, reached the right hands. The biggest question still hanging in the air was what would happen to the surveillance program that had secretly tracked thousands of innocent people. A month ago, no one had imagined they'd even get a chance to ask that. But now, after uncovering the entire network and exposing the people who ran it, the government had no choice but to shut it down. Independent auditors were being assigned. Oversight committees had been formed. Even the media, once skeptical, was now flooding the story with coverage, finally seeing what Rebecca and Navarro had risked everything to reveal. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was more justice than anyone expected at the start. Around noon, the team was called into a briefing room where the deputy director wanted to thank them personally. It wasn't a flashy speech. It wasn't rehearsed. It was simple, a man standing in front of the people who had saved the agency from a scandal big enough to swallow it whole. "You uncovered something that should never have existed," he said. "You protected the public and the integrity of this institution. And you did it while risking your careers, your safety, and more. You have my respect. And more importantly, you have my gratitude. Navarro, sitting beside Rebecca, nudged her quietly and whispered, "We should frame that." She had a laugh behind her hand. But even with all the praise, applause, and congratulations, both agents felt the weight of everything they had witnessed. Justice didn't erase damage. Exposing the truth didn't undo the years of surveillance. But at least the truth was finally visible, and that mattered. After the meeting, Rebecca stepped outside for air. The day was mild, the breeze soft, carrying the smell of street vendors and the distant hum of traffic. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel watched. She didn't feel hunted. She didn't feel trapped in someone else's shadow. Just free. That was when she heard footsteps and saw Navarro joining her. "You're quiet," he said. "Just thinking. Dangerous habit." "Not today." He leaned on the rail beside her, both of them watching the street below. People walking, talking, carrying backpacks and coffee cups, heads down, just living their lives, completely unaware of how close they had come to losing their privacy forever. "You ever wonder how close we were to failing?" Navarro asked. "All the time. Think we would have stopped if someone told us to walk away?" Rebecca shook her head. "Not a chance." He nodded. "Good. Because the truth needed someone stubborn." They both laughed at that, because it was true. Stubbornness was probably what kept them alive. As they returned inside to finish the last round of paperwork, the door to the building opened, and a man stepped out. Agent Keller, the one who had been framed, betrayed, and nearly destroyed by the corrupted surveillance team. He spotted Rebecca and Navarro immediately. His face softened with genuine relief. "I heard," he said. "Everything came out. They dropped all charges against me this morning." "That's great news," Rebecca said. "No," he corrected gently. "That's your work. You saved my name." Navarro rubbed the back of his neck. "You would have done the same for us." Keller let out a breath that sounded like someone finally setting down a heavy weight. "I just wanted to say thank you. And I'm here if either of you ever need anything." They exchanged a nod, a silent understanding between people who had seen the worst of corruption and still chose to fight it. After Keller walked off, Navarro leaned in and muttered, "We should get free coffee for life after all this." "I'd settle for one quiet week," Rebecca said. But quiet weeks don't exist in their line of work. Later that evening, as the office started emptying, Rebecca stayed behind, double-checking the last digital logs. She didn't have to, but something inside her wanted the reassurance, the certainty that everything connected to that secret program had truly been shut down. While reviewing the files, she found something unexpected. A folder, unlabeled, unassigned, sitting inside a hidden directory that wasn't flagged in the original sweep. Her stomach dropped. Another file? Another lead? Another problem? She almost clicked it, then didn't. Navarro appeared beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Still working?" "There's something here," she said quietly. "I don't know what it is." He stared at the screen for a moment, then gently placed the coffee next to her. "Rebecca, we ended this case. You ended it. If this was important, it would have been buried deeper or flagged earlier. Maybe it's nothing." "Maybe," she said. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to live in the shadows of this job. Not anymore." She looked at the file again. Then she deleted it. Not because she was scared, and not because she wanted to ignore anything important, but because she understood something now. Some battles end. Some darkness doesn't need to be chased forever. And some chapters deserve to close. She shut down the computer, locked the case file, picked up her coffee, and walked out of the building as the city lights shimmered to life. For the first time in months, the world didn't feel like a maze of secrets. It felt like a place with choices, a place with hope, a place where the truth, even when almost buried, still found a way to the surface. And as Rebecca and Navarro stepped outside into the cool night, both of them felt the same thing: relief, pride, and a reminder that no matter how complicated the world becomes, justice is still worth fighting for. Because sometimes the most dangerous surveillance leads to the most powerful truth. And the moment Rebecca and Navarro stepped into the abandoned terminal, everything felt sharper, heavier, as if the air itself was holding its breath. This was where the trail had led them. The final location traced through months of hidden logs, encrypted messages, and corrupt data streams. The surveillance network they'd been fighting wasn't just a system. It was a living thing with roots that went deeper than either of them expected. And tonight, they were finally confronting the person who built those roots. They moved carefully, their footsteps echoing in the wide space. Dust floated through beams of light cutting in from broken windows. Old departure screens flickered faintly, powered just enough to cast a ghostly glow across the floor. Navarro whispered that the feed was live, meaning someone was still inside and monitoring them. Rebecca steadied her breathing. She didn't want fear to guide her. She wanted clarity because this moment, this exact moment, was what everything had been building toward. Near the back wall, a soft hum broke the silence. They followed the sound to a makeshift operations hub made from old flight desks and scattered monitors. And standing there, calm and unbothered, was Director Hale, the man everyone trusted, the one who had publicly supported the investigation, the one who had claimed to fight against internal corruption. But now, seeing him here, surrounded by servers that weren't supposed to exist, everything made a sickening kind of sense. Hale looked up with a faint smile, like he'd been expecting them. "You're persistent," he said, voice steady, almost amused. "That's both admirable and inconvenient." Rebecca stepped forward. "It ends tonight. All of it." Hale nodded slowly. "Yes, it does, but not in the way you think." Before either of them could react, he touched a key sequence on the console, and every monitor lit up at once, showing hundreds of live surveillance feeds. Streets, homes, offices, places no one should have been monitoring. It was overwhelming, like witnessing the entire country breathing at once through stolen windows. "The world runs on control," Hale said. "People want safety. They want order. That's what I gave them." "You stole their freedom," Navarro said, fist clenched. "You built a system that treated everyone like suspects. I built a system that protected them from the real threats." Hale's voice hardened. "You think you exposed corruption, but all you did was interfere with something bigger than you understand." Rebecca didn't let him finish. She stepped toward the console and pulled the main drives. The screens blinked, flickered, then went dark. And for the first time, Hale's composure cracked. "This is bigger than all of you," he snapped. "Shutting down the program won't matter. I have backups. Fail-safes. You've barely scratched." Navarro cut him off. "You're done." At that exact moment, a loud metallic clank echoed through the terminal. Hale's eyes darted past them, and Rebecca spun around just in time to see a shadow move behind a pillar. For a split second, she thought it was another agent. But then the figure stepped out, and everything inside her froze. It was Agent Keller, alive, armed, and looking nothing like the man they cleared of wrongdoing. Rebecca felt her throat tighten. "Keller, what are you doing here?" He didn't answer. His expression was cold, unreadable. And then Hale spoke, voice dripping with victory. "I told you this was bigger than you." Keller didn't just survive. He was part of the original team, one of the architects. Rebecca's world tilted. Navarro shifted beside her, ready to step between them, but Keller nodded toward the destroyed console and said, "You really shouldn't have done that." The betrayal stung deeper than anything Hale could have revealed. They had trusted Keller, fought for him, freed him, and he had used them the entire time. But then, something unexpected happened. Hale tried to walk toward him, but Keller raised his gun. Not at Rebecca, not at Navarro, at Hale. "You were supposed to keep this controlled," Keller said. "You got greedy. You lost sight of the mission." Hale's face went pale. "You're making a mistake." "No, you already made it." The moment stretched, tense, and razor-thin. Rebecca realized Keller wasn't loyal to the surveillance system anymore. He was loyal to himself. And Hale was just another loose end. Before Keller could pull the trigger, Rebecca acted. She moved fast, grabbing a metal rod from the floor and striking Keller's wrist. The gunshot fired upward, exploding a ceiling panel instead of finding a body. Navarro lunged forward and tackled him while Hale tried to flee through the side door. Rebecca chased him. The hallway outside was narrow and dark. Hale ran, stumbling, desperate, No longer the calm mastermind, but a man watching his empire crumble. Rebecca caught up at the emergency exit, slamming him against the wall. "It's over," she said, breath heavy. "You think stopping me will change anything?" he hissed. "Someone will rebuild what I created. Then we'll stop them too." For a moment, their eyes locked, and Hale understood he'd lost. Completely. When they brought him back into the terminal, Navarro had Keller restrained. The entire system had fallen in one night. The truth was exposed, the mastermind captured, and the traitor unmasked. But there was one more twist, one none of them saw coming. As they escorted both men outside where backup agents were arriving, Keller said quietly, almost too calmly, "You shut down the main system. But there's something you didn't find." Rebecca turned. "What are you talking about?" Keller smiled faintly. "The off-grid server. The one running everything automatically. You think Hale built all of this alone? You think I acted alone? This goes way beyond us." Navarro stepped closer. "Where is it?" Keller shrugged. "Even if I told you, it's already moved." The agents exchanged a look, a mix of frustration and determination. The major threat was gone. The creators were captured. But a small part of the machine still existed somewhere out there. Not enough to restart the network, but enough to guess that someone else, somewhere, might try. Rebecca exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "Then we'll handle it when it comes. One step at a time." Keller didn't reply. Hill didn't look back. And the agents didn't let fear dictate what came next. They walked into the flashing lights of arriving vehicles, knowing the climax of this long hunt had finally hit. They won the biggest battle. The system that once watched the entire country had fallen. The truth was out, but the twist, the final lingering thread, reminded them that the world would always have hidden corners, always have shadows, always have someone trying to reshape power in the dark. And as Rebecca and Navarro stood there, breathing in the cold night air, they understood something important. The story wasn't ending. It was beginning a new chapter. But the victory tonight was real, and it was theirs. Rebecca stood at the edge of the floodlit parking lot long after Hale and Keller had been taken away, watching the last of the evidence vans pull out. The night felt quieter than it had in months. No more sudden alerts. No more encrypted files to chase down. No more second-guessing who was watching them from behind some hidden camera feed. The abandoned terminal looked almost harmless now, as if it had been waiting for this ending too. Navarro walked up beside her, his hands in his pockets, letting out a slow breath that carried the weight of everything they had survived. They didn't talk for a moment. They didn't need to. Sometimes silence said everything that words couldn't. Eventually, Navarro said that the team had finished sweeping the building. All hidden servers had been pulled, every cable cut, every device tagged and packed. It was done, but Rebecca wasn't smiling. She kept thinking about Keller's last words, the off-grid server, the hint that someone else might have been involved from the beginning. She didn't want to let fear spoil the victory, but she couldn't ignore the part of her that always saw the cracks others overlooked. They got in the car and headed back toward headquarters, the city lights blinking past the windows. The world outside looked normal, unaware of how close it had come to becoming something controlled by the wrong hands. Rebecca felt grateful for the quiet streets, for the ordinary lives happening in small apartments and corner shops. Ordinary life was what this whole fight was about, protecting it, keeping it safe from those who wanted control over everything. When they arrived at the operations building, the air inside felt lighter. The endless tension that once hung over the halls had finally broken. Agents who had been working without rest were sitting for the first time in days, talking softly, drinking coffee that was finally warm and not the burnt stuff from emergency pots. Someone even laughed, an exhausted, relieved laugh that reminded everyone they were still human. Chief Morrison met them at the entrance to the debriefing room. She looked tired but proud. She told them that Hale and Keller were already being questioned by a neutral investigative body, and that oversight teams had been called in to review every part of the surveillance program. It would take months to sort through, but the important thing was that transparency was returning. People would have answers. Families affected by the hidden monitoring would be contacted. And most importantly, this kind of unchecked power wouldn't be allowed to happen again. Inside the debriefing room, Morrison thanked them. Not with a formal speech, not with the cold professionalism that usually filled these meetings, but with a simple, real moment of appreciation. She said they had protected the country from a future nobody voted for, a future nobody wanted. She said they had stood up when it was easier to stay silent. And Rebecca felt something loosen in her chest, something she hadn't noticed tightening until now. After the debriefing, Navarro suggested they take a walk outside before heading home. The sun was starting to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the city. Morning traffic hummed in the distance. It felt peaceful. Rebecca told him she kept thinking about how close they came to losing control of everything, and how easy it was for someone with authority to twist a system into something dangerous if nobody was watching. Navarro nodded and said that maybe that was the lesson they were meant to learn. But safety didn't come from watching people. It came from accountability, from checks and balances, from people who were willing to ask hard questions, even when the answers made them uncomfortable. He said that the whole experience reminded him that power always needs boundaries, because without them, even the best intentions could turn into something harmful. Rebecca thought about Hale, about how he had started with the idea of order and ended up creating a structure that violated people's trust. She wondered at what point he crossed the line. Maybe it was gradual, little compromises he justified to himself, until he no longer recognized the harm he was causing. It made her think about the importance of staying grounded, about listening to the people affected by big decisions, about remembering that every data point on a screen was a person with a life. Back inside, Rebecca found the small box she had kept locked away in her desk drawer during the entire investigation. It held old case notes, early clues, and a map they had marked with red circles back when they didn't fully understand what they were hunting. She opened it and looked through the papers one last time. So much confusion, so much doubt, and yet they had pushed through it. They had refused to give up. She decided to shred the files, not because she wanted to forget the case, but because it was finished. They had done what they came to do. Later that evening, Rebecca and Navarro sat in a quiet diner, eating simple food that tasted better than any meal they'd had during the long nights working the case. The waitress asked if they had come from an overnight shift, and they laughed, saying something like that. They didn't explain further. They didn't need to. Navarro said he sometimes wondered what would have happened if they hadn't double-checked that one digital trail weeks ago, if they hadn't taken that detour, if they hadn't questioned the assumptions everyone else accepted. Rebecca admitted she thought about it too. It made the victory feel bigger, not because of pride, but because of relief that they had chosen the harder path, and that choice had made all the difference. When they finished eating, they stepped outside under the soft glow of streetlights. The city was calm. No alarms, no hidden watchers, just the quiet hum of a place settling into a new sense of safety. Rebecca felt a tired smile forming. For the first time in weeks, she could breathe without looking over her shoulder. On their way back, they received a message that a task force was being formed to monitor any signs of the remaining off-grid node Keller mentioned. Rebecca felt a flicker of concern, then let it fade. There would always be another challenge, another mystery, but they had done everything they could for now, and whatever came next, they would handle it. As she reached her doorstep, Rebecca paused for a moment. The sky was turning a soft blue, signaling the start of a new day. She thought about everything she had learned, about trust, power, courage, and how easily systems meant to protect people could be misused if nobody questioned them. She thought about how important it was to stay aware, to stay human, to care about the effects of decisions made behind closed doors. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, finally letting the calm settle over her. This chapter was over. The surveillance network had fallen. The truth was out. And though there were loose ends in the shadows, tonight she allowed herself peace. Because even in a world full of hidden corners, the simple truth remained. Light always finds its way in. And if people kept paying attention, kept asking questions, kept choosing integrity over convenience, then the world, messy and flawed as it was, would always have a fighting chance. Rebecca closed the door softly behind her, knowing the story had reached its end, and the rest, whatever it might be, would come in its own time.